Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual panel discussion on enhancing US-Japan cooperation on global supply chains. I'm Miano, Director and Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative, housed within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'm really delighted to be leading today's discussion with a group of distinguished speakers who will bring a broad range of expertise to this set of important issues. As many in our audience know, geopolitical uncertainty driven by enduring US-China tensions during the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in growing calls to realign global supply chains of industries critical to national security and economic competitiveness. As the race for global leadership on strategic emerging technologies heats up, supply chain policy has become a key strategic question for the United States and its allies and partners. In particular, with the inauguration of the new administrations in both Washington, D.C. and Tokyo, the United States and Japan have a key opportunity to revisit coordination of their efforts to establish secure and resilient supply chains. In the Asia Security Initiative that I'm running, we have been tracking this issue sets very closely, and we're preparing to release a new report focused on how the United States and Japan, the two countries that are taking major steps to define new supply chain policies, so how they can enhance and expand cooperative efforts moving forward. We are proud to be conducting this project in partnership with our friends at the Embassy of Japan. I'll kick off today's discussion by introducing our panelists and sharing some of the key takeaways from our upcoming report on this topic. But before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this conversation is on the record and open to the public. Our audience members tuning in via Zoom can submit their questions using the Q&A function, and I will turn to audience questions before the end of today's session. So now let me introduce our great lineup of speakers. We are honored today to be joined by Mr. Bill Reinsch, Senior Advisor and Shaw Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Mr. Shin Oya, Senior Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Initiative and Chief Representative for Strategic Research at the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Mr. Stephen Ezell, Vice President, Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And we have Mr. Yoshihiro Kato, partner at Holtworth & Kato. Thank you all for joining us today again for this timely discussion. With that, I'd like to start by sharing a summary of some of the key takeaways from our upcoming report to help spark our discussion. I'll be brief, but here are some of the main points of analysis worth highlighting. First, President Biden, like President Trump, is making supply chain security and resiliency a major economic priority. Their effort to maintain advantages in technologies that are critical to national security and economic competitiveness have taken two different approaches simultaneously. One is to slow down Chinese efforts to develop its high-tech sector, and the other is to boost the United States' own domestic capabilities, such as by reshoring. We see this continuity from Trump to Biden when it comes to supply chain policy. Unlike Trump, however, his early actions, such as executive order, suggest more specific targeting of supply chain for particular critical technologies, including semiconductor, rare earths, batteries, and medical supplies. And what we might think of this as kind of targeted decoupling from China's economy, focused on first identifying and then reducing supply chain dependence on China across a set of strategically critical sectors. In this way, we see the Biden administration balancing between continuity and differentiation of his supply chain policy when compared to the Trump administration. I'm particularly eager to hear from our panel what they think about a number of President Biden's early actions on supply chains and whether you agree his approach can be called targeted decoupling. Similarly, Prime Minister Suga seems to be continuing a supply chain policy trend seen under Prime Minister Abe. On one hand, Japan has been an early mover in terms of pushing for policies, including subsidies that will help onshore or reshore supply chains away from China and back to Japan and Southeast Asia. On the other end, the rhetoric surrounding these policies is much more about seeking resilience and competitiveness without calling for any kind of decoupling from China. Careful way of framing the challenge at hand. So figuring out how US and Japanese policy goals and rhetoric converge in useful ways and how to adapt cooperation both bilaterally and with other trusted partners around areas of divergence will be important to their success moving forward. Our research has been also underscored the importance of two sectors, among several that both Biden and Suga have targeted for policy action, semiconductors and rare earths. Both of these areas of key interest to US and Japanese government and private sectors, and each brings their own set of unique challenges. Some of our panelists today have deep expertise in semiconductors in particular, so I'm excited to share more details about analysis and hear how they evaluate their prospect for US-Japan cooperation on this front. Overall, we have a number of key questions that will help drive our final policy recommendation for both countries. Where can the two countries build on and expand existing programs and cooperation? What kind of working groups, steering committees, or public-private partnerships would be useful? How can the two countries leverage broader multilateral network of techno-democracies and the Quad? What other key players should be involved when it comes to industries like semiconductors? Ultimately, what are the most important policy tools available in both countries to achieve supply chain diversification that is effective and sustainable for both government and private firms? To dive into these questions and more, I'd like to turn to each of our panelists to hear their initial thought on this set of issues. Starting with Mr. Bill Reich, can you please share your assessment of early actions of the Biden administration in terms of supply chains?
Well, thank you very much, Myeon. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and have a chance to comment on this. I think I'm going to try to stay at 30,000 meters, and then we can drill down into specifics a little bit later because I only have a few minutes at this point. And I want to echo, I think, the premise that this program began on. Common challenges require common responses. And I think it's clear that the United States and Japan, not only the United States and Japan, but certainly the two of us, face many of the same challenges that are presented by China. But we need to think about what coordination and cooperation means. The metaphor that I've used frequently in the past is if you're in a race, there's only two ways to win. You run faster or you trip the other guy. And both strategies are legitimate in their place. I think when it comes to running faster, this is probably an area where the United States and Japan compete with each other as well as with China. And it's probably an area where we're going to continue to compete, and we're each going to try to run faster. A significant part of the President Biden's program, manifest in his Build Back Better document, is exactly that: to put more money into innovation and recapture our global lead as the world's biggest, I guess, and fastest innovator. I think Stephen will have more to say about that. I don't think this is an area where we necessarily need to cooperate. I think this is an area where our scientists, engineers, and inventors, and your scientists, engineers, and inventors each do their own thing, and we both end up stronger as a result. Tripping the other guy, in other words, trying to slow them down, particularly when they're breaking the rules, I think is an area where we can cooperate. In fact, we have to cooperate if we're going to succeed. I think that means a number of things, and what I would focus on is cooperation, essentially on tech transfer issues with China, and that means focusing on both investment via CFIUS and Japan's counterpart organization, and also on export controls. We already cooperate extensively in both these areas, but given the magnitude of the challenge and the urgency, I think there's some more things that we can do. In that regard, I'd suggest several things where we can begin. First of all, I think we need a common definition of national security. We've been through an administration in the last 4 years that had a very broad definition of almost anything being covered by the national security umbrella. If you listen to Peter Navarro in particular, you got that impression. I think we need to be more careful in describing what national security is and defining it, because if you do, as you define it, there are economic consequences. What we're proposing to do are prevent transactions of investments or shipments of technology that will have an adverse economic impact on us. So we need to be careful as we go forward. And in particular, if we're going to cooperate, we need to have a common definition of what national security means so we don't make decisions that are at odds with each other. In order to do that, though, we also need more information sharing. And I think not just information sharing on broad industrial trends, but we at some point are going to have to discuss information sharing on specific transactions. I think it's important for your government to know what the United States is considering approving and vice versa. This may be a step too far for governments, but I think that it's if we're going to truly cooperate, we have to get there. We have to find a way to have that kind of more detailed cooperation. I think we also need to coordinate on process so that we are on the same page in terms of timing and sort of sequencing as well. Inevitably, as the pace of technological change moves faster and faster, the risk of getting countries that are like-minded getting out of step with each other and not all coming to the same conclusion at the same time grows. And I think that's another, we have to work on making sure that our processes are working closely together to make sure that that doesn't happen. And finally, this is not just a US-Japan issue, as I mentioned before. This is an issue that involves other countries that are developing sophisticated new technologies. And particularly in the 2 case studies that you had in your paper, semiconductors and rare earths, I think this is an important consideration. On semiconductors, looking particularly at the equipment, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, which are really the key to the kingdom, if you will, on this. Japan and the United States are not the only ones. There's a few others, could be a very few others. Korea and the Netherlands are the 2 that come to mind. And it's important that we try to bring in all of the producers of the goods that we're concerned about in order to make sure that any controls that we end up imposing are effective. One of the things I learned in my time on Capitol Hill and then in the government where I ran the export control program in the Clinton administration is if you're unilateral, you don't, it's a self-defeating policy because you leave people out there doing their own thing in ways that are not going to help you. You need to try to bring everybody that to the table. We have regimes that do that, but they do it slowly and they do it incompletely. And one of the issues that's making the rounds around Washington now, which I hope our Japanese colleagues on the panel can comment on, is the idea of smaller plurilaterals that deal with specific technologies where we could get together with everybody that produces next generation equipment in that sector and decide that collectively we will cooperate on common goals. So that's what I would suggest as a way to proceed. And I turn it now back to you, Myeon.
Thank you so much. I think we already have many items to discuss later. So now I'd like to turn to Shinoya.
Thank you very much, Myeon, and thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity for me. I'd like to make 3 or 4 comments. First, I think COVID-19 taught us that it's quite important for increasing resilience. However, we need to focus on specific area. That means that because there is trade-off between resilience and efficiency, So we have to be careful about not try to do in every products, in every area, but we need to focus when we consider increasing resilience. I think Frederick is a great mention. He who defends everything defends nothing. So focusing for a specific area, that's very important. And at the same time, we have to be very careful that this resilience discussion will shifting to protectionist sentiment. This is number one. Number two, of course, Japan-US cooperation is very important. For example, in case of export control, Japanese side also clearly understand export control is very important. However, sometimes it happens that the US decides this product is should be controlled, and using US connection. So in effect, this is also extraterritorially affected to Japanese companies' activity too. So I think, before US decides specific export control, pre-event discussion or coordination is very important. One of that is, definition of the national security, which Bill mentioned. I totally agree with that. So what national security or what critical products, definition of critical technology, such coordination or cooperation is very important. This is second point. Third point is not only protecting, but also promotion is very important. And promoting, when I say promoting, this is very broad concept, I think. For example, setting up standard or joint R&D, or supporting investment for very critical product. These things is very important, and it's more effective for us to cooperate in this sphere too. For example, in case of a standard, maybe we discuss what should be standard for the future technology or no. Or in case of investment, we have JBIC, I affiliate with JBIC, and also US has DFC. So joint cooperation for critical infrastructure. This has already happened. We jointly supported that parallel the undersea cable together with Australian similar institution. So cooperation in promotion sphere. This is also important. This is number three. And number four, maybe we can expand cooperation. I mean, US-Japan cooperation is core. But fortunately, mid-March, Quad summit happened finally, and they decided that they are going to have 3 working groups: vaccine and also climate change and technology. And I understand that the exact area of cooperation has not yet decided, but I think there is a potential that we can increase the scope for technology working group. I think this is the Mion also that thinking about and writing that in your brief, draft brief. I think this is a very good idea. So under technology working group, there can be some subgroup. Of course, that will increase the rare earths or semiconductor, of course, but other things too. And also, we should go beyond Quad 2 probably. Of course, it depends on that area. But if we think about semiconductor, maybe cooperation with Netherlands and also Korea, this is probably required. So expanding to European countries, or of course, the ASEAN country too. So that's very important, I think. These are 4 points I'd like to mention at the first. Thank you.
Thank you, Shin. Thank you so much. Now I would like to turn to Stephen Ezel. Stephen?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ola, and to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to participate today. It's a delight. Well, first, Dr. Ola, I really want to commend you on the draft you've issued on enhancing US-Japan collaboration and supply chains. I think you do a very strong job of contextualizing the supply chain goals and objectives of the Biden and Suga administrations, addressing the challenges and opportunities, and actually providing a very strong list of policy recommendations to further enhance collaboration. I know we'll talk more about that, but one recommendation I particularly endorse is establishing these sector-specific steering committees to enhance public-private partnership in high-tech industries, especially first. That's a great idea, as Dr. Mensch said, coordination of these issues is absolutely imperative. But some initial framing thoughts for our discussion. First, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly shown that free societies are overly dependent on communist China for both key inputs to advanced technology industries, such as advanced pharmaceutical ingredients for drugs or rare earths for ICT products and semiconductors, as well as finished manufactured goods from medical supplies to smartphones. Reducing dependency on China can enhance US and allied security, bolster supply chain resiliency. For example, many US manufacturers are now moving to a China plus one strategy, meaning having manufacturing based in China plus one other country for kind of resiliency and security. Boost employment in manufacturing industries at home in both the US and Japan. And importantly, denude the Chinese Communist Party's ability to exert leverage over foreign enterprises. For these reasons, I think the US actually has much to learn from the manufacturing reshoring strategies that Japan and several other nations, including Korea, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom, have actually implemented. Dr. Oh, as you know in your report, Japan has now rolled out 2 rounds of subsidies worth about $3 billion in July and November 2020 to encourage firms to relocate production back to Japan through onshoring subsidies. I understand as many as 230 Japanese companies have now availed themselves of that opportunity. Similarly, in Taiwan, Taiwan's quote, action plan for welcoming overseas Taiwanese businesses to return to invest in Taiwan, which launched in 2009, has since generated over $42 billion in investment from 783 companies, with at least 2/3 of that representing Taiwanese manufacturing activity, moving back from Taiwan to Taiwan. Elsewhere in the United Kingdom, their Project Defend seeks to reduce British reliance on Chinese production of critical products such as pharmaceuticals, PPEs, and advanced technologies. My first point is that we all need to be working together on these types of strategies to look at supply chain reshoring, identifying critical vulnerabilities and dependencies in China and bringing them back to the US. Your paper contextualized the Biden strategy as perhaps targeted decoupling. I think that may be thematically right. I still think that the Biden administration is working through their thinking, both in terms of their overall China trade economic strategy and exactly how to implement these supply chain policies. Of course, that's the point of the Biden's executive order on supply chain review that they're undertaking now. So I think the final end game is under development. But broadly, I do think that the United States needs a coherent supply chain reshoring strategy. And one specific idea it should include, in addition to some base package of investment subsidies of $5 billion or so, is that Congress could pass a time-limited tax incentive for firms that move Chinese production to U.S. Labor Department designated labor surplus areas. So we could have kind of reverse auctions to provide incentives for companies that would move reshoring back. And so essentially much to learn from what Japan is doing here. And one final thought before I turn it back to you, Leon. One other element of the pandemic, as we've seen recently, has been a global shortage of semiconductors. In the US, we may lose as much as 1/4 of auto production from companies like Ford here in the first quarter of 2020 due to the shortage of semiconductor chips. However, looking at Japanese companies like Toyota, they were actually able to stockpile many of these semiconductors, and they haven't had these supply chain interruptions. So I think there's much that US companies can learn from Japanese companies about their supply chain management strategies, and that could be an opportunity for greater collaboration on ensuring supply chain collaboration. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So now we have Yoshikato.
Good morning, Dr. O. Thanks for having me on this very much important topic to discuss today. I'd like to make a couple of comments on the from perspective of semiconductor supply chain stuff. This is very challenging that how we deal with the challenge imposed by China. Then when talking about supply chain, at the same time, supply chain, semiconductor supply chain is global, but also semiconductor market is global as well. So we need to make sure that those balanced approach, but we would do in the supply chain security, also enhance the market for the global market for the semiconductor as well. because the industry itself, grew for the years based on the free and open market, international trading system. So the supply chain itself, we need to work with not only between U.S. and Japan to involve those like-minded countries to make sure we can compete with deal with new challenges posed. Then at the same time, those U.S.-Japan cooperation should enhance multilateral, effort, plurilateral effort, as well as trilateral effort. So the challenge posed by China is stemming from the government subsidy to the semiconductor industries. So that the discussion we had in the previous administration amongst three countries, U.S., Japan, Europe, the trilateral dialogue to make a reform at the WTO, especially including subsidy, that would be the area we also need to work together. That also relate to the export of those materials, equipment as well. So we need to focus on those areas to revitalize the multilateral forum for us to play with. Then, as Mr. Reich pointed out, I think supply chain is also the globally expanded supply chain is the area of our cooperation. But at the same time, there is the area of our competition as well. So U.S. and Japan needs to carefully coordinate what is the feasible to achieve as a collaboration, and also what is the area we need to make sure we have own competitiveness. So those are the issues we need to see in this year, especially the executive order on semiconductor supply chain, which will be come out at the beginning of June. That will be one of the very important sign what U.S. envisions in terms of semiconductor supply chains. So as Mr. Oya pointed out, the U.S. is the leader in this topic. So we need to see, what is the, plan that laid out in the, supply chain risk and resilience in response to the President Biden's executive order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kato-san. And thank you, everyone, for offering your really insightful opening remarks. Now, I'd like to, go back to Bill Reich and so asking a question. So you recently wrote a piece on what you call innovation policy, and also in terms of export control. So, what do you see the key difference between innovation policy from the present and industrial policy of the past? And what do you think that Biden administration should approach this innovative policy? And as you mentioned earlier, you serve as Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Control during the Clinton administration. And where do you see measures such as export control fitting into U.S. innovation policy?
Well, that's a big topic. I think Stephen could probably comment as well on innovation policy, because ITIF has done a lot more work on it than I have. For me, the difference really between innovation policy and industrial policy is more semantic than anything else. Industrial policy, which I was for, I've been for it for a long time, is really the mobilization of government resources to achieve national objectives. And the United States is good at that. We've been good at that for a very long time. The term fell into disfavor from in the conservative part of our political spectrum, because they regarded it as interference in the market and picking winners and losers. I think that's an oversimplification, but the nice thing about innovation policy is that it's just a new word, a new term for the same thing. And one of the things that I think opponents, frankly, have discovered over the years is that you can sell it to conservatives if you call it a national security item. And they'll buy a lot of things in the name of national security that they would not buy if you just said this is going to make the economy run better. And that's a convenient conjunction of thinking right now, because the fact is we have a security challenge, and the relationship with China is very much as much a security challenge as it is an economic and competitiveness challenge. So it's relatively easy to go to Congress, which where these things always end up, because any policy like this involves spending money. So you end up in Congress. They get it, and there is substantial bipartisan support for doing a wide variety of things to help meet the challenge that China presents. So on the running faster side, I think we've got a lot more agreement now than we have in the past. If you look at the 40 past years of debating industrial policy, I hate to be partisan, but the reality is when the Democrats come in, it waxes, and when the Republicans come in, it wanes. And they don't want to spend the same amount of money that the Democrats want to spend. And the debate has gone on. We now have an opportunity, because the context is different, to reconcile the sides and say, look, we face a huge challenge on both security and economic fronts, and we need to do some significant things to meet that challenge. How export controls fits into all that is, really what I think a significant part of this event is about, and that's the tripping the other guy part of the equation, not the running faster part of the equation, and it's a challenge. And I think all of our panelists can comment on this. The people that are in that business, and I was for a substantial period of time, have to walk a very fine line between controlling too little, in which case stuff escapes that you don't want your adversary to have, but also against controlling too much. Because if you control too much, two things will happen. One, you create an incentive for other parties to develop the same technology and essentially to work around you, which is not good. And the other thing that happens is that you starve our high-tech industries of the earnings that they need to supplement their R&D budgets to develop next generation technologies. This was something that I think grew out of work done in the Clinton administration, largely by Bill Perry, when he was first Undersecretary and then later Secretary of Defense. And one of his assistants told me at one point, and he wasn't joking, that the problem the Pentagon had was that the life cycle of the stuff they were buying was shorter than the procurement process that they had to use to obtain it. And he was referring primarily to software. But Perry realized the dilemma that if the military relied on specially designed military specifications, they were always going to be behind the technology curve. And that led Perry to say, what we need to do is work directly with our high-tech companies, buy commercial off-the-shelf, state-of-the-art equipment, and adapt what we're doing to that. And by the way, work with the companies to help them develop additional items that are tailored to our particular needs. But if you think about that, that turns export controls on its head, because in order to do that, the Defense Department becomes the best customer of, not the best customer, becomes a customer of our high-tech companies, both hardware and software. But they're never going to be more than 1 or 2% of those companies' business. Our high-tech companies make their business in the private sector, make their money in the private sector, and particularly they make their money in exporting. And I'm sure Stephen can provide data about that. So that creates a kind of a dilemma in our defense establishment, because they realize that what we need from a security point of view is healthy private high-tech companies innovating and inventing new stuff that our defense establishment can use. The way they stay healthy is by exporting. And so you need to have a different attitude about export controls than the historic one, which is simply, deny anything important to the enemy. And what we developed, I thought, was a sound policy. Now, the interesting debate here is whether our policies run out of gas, but for a long time, our policy has been, let's continue to sell to problematic countries, but let's make sure they're a generation or two behind technologically. That way, we keep them dependent on us, but we keep them behind. That's been a very successful policy up until now. We're now faced with a challenge in China, which is a country that is both willing and able, resource-wise, to develop their own leading-edge technology. And I think we have to figure out how we adapt to that new reality. Export controls cannot be the only part of it, but they inevitably have to be part of it, and particularly the enforcement part, because a lot of what the Chinese have acquired is done so illicitly or illegally, and we've not been as effective as we should be in trying to stop that. Very long answer, and I'm sorry, so I turn it over to others.
No, I think that was like perfect and excellent. And I think really perfect segue to Stephen's that I was going to ask you. So number one, so I'd like to hear your, if you'd like to add anything and reactions to what Bill just said. And also I like to ask, building on your recent publication, on both China's semiconductor policy and ally strategy for semiconductor. And you said that you made a point that such Chinese state-led development distort the global market and affect the ability of firms in other countries to innovate. So can you briefly walk us through your argument here, and again, your live strategy report, and also add your thought to Bill Reinsch?
Well, sure, Dr. Oy. Yes, our report looked at the deleterious impact China's innovation mercantilist strategies in the semiconductor have on the global industry. And the key point to make there is semiconductors, like pharmaceuticals, is an advanced technology industry that's characterized by peculiar economics, especially that the marginal cost is different than the average cost of innovation in these industries, meaning that it can cost billions of dollars to invent that new to the world semiconductor or that new to the world drug, but incremental copies come off the line at cost. And because of the very intense upfront cost of R&D and design, companies have to be able to recoup those investments by being able to sell into global markets, by being assured that they're not confronted by competitors who are able to compete on non-market-based terms because they've been excessively subsidized by their governments, or in dealing with companies that are stealing their intellectual property. So if we want innovation in these advanced tech industries to flourish, we have to ensure that companies are able to effectively earn profits from one generation of innovation to finance investment in the next, because it is the profits from the 7-nanometer chip line that leads to the 5 and the 3-nanometer line. And our argument in that report is that a number of the policies China has elected to use to try to compete in the sector are mercantilist in nature, and therefore may undermine market-based competition in this industry globally. For instance, if there was a wonderful report from the OECD on looking at subsidies in the semiconductor industry, and they essentially found that as much as 40% of the revenues of Chinese semiconductor firms are direct government transfers, right? Certainly, if you look at China's National Integrated Circuit Plan, their $150 billion strategy to make their country competitive in this industry, it certainly contains a lot of fair, legitimate elements like investing in R&D, right? Like building talented workforces. That's all fine. But some of the policies, such as targeted intellectual property theft, such as government subsidies to go out and acquire firms in international marketplaces, under the veneer that these are private equity-based, market-based transactions, in fact, just government-subsidized acquisitions of foreign technology companies. That is not competition that's consonant with the commitments that China has made in the World Trade Organization to predicate its economic activity under the principles of private enterprise-led, rules-governed, market-based trade in accordance with the foundational principles of non-discrimination, national treatment, reciprocity, right? So that's what our report got at, right? And kind of what we argue in response is that the United States and like-minded nations need to collaborate to collectively advance the innovation and competitive capacities of their semiconductor ecosystems. And we can do that across 4 areas. We can, for instance, coordinate on technology development. If you look at the PCAST report a couple of years back on ensuring leadership in semiconductors, one thing that was called for was moonshots, right? Kind of long-term, 10-year, kind of decade-long plans to kind of develop like entirely semiconductor computing architectures, right? Well, if that's something, like-minded countries can co-invest in to develop novel intellectual property and share it amongst like-minded countries to advance our ability to compete. We can coordinate with ecosystem support, right? How we manage the development of technical standards, how we build workforces in these industries. As Bill talked about, we can coordinate on technology protection, our use of export controls, our coordination to combat intellectual property theft or economic espionage. And we can collaborate as well on a range of kind of supportive trade regimes, policies, and practices, like the Trilateral Trade Ministers Working Group, like expanding the Information Technology Agreements, the ITA, an agreement that eliminates tariffs on trade and ICT goods. I think it would behoove us, as you called for Dr. Oy, on the Semiconductor Steering Committee idea, for like-minded countries to sit down and ask hard questions. How can we work with one another on technology development, ecosystem support, technology protection, and developing trade rules that ensure that innovative industries flourish in the global economy?
Thank you. And I'd like to turn to Shinoya. So then having, said that, how should we cope with Chinese economic origin? And you recently wrote on the establishment of technology alliance and made up of democracies with large economic capabilities, right? So could you tell us a little bit more about how this alliance would look like and what function would it play, and especially with regard to, critical technologies like semiconductors?
Thank you for asking. That's a very important question. So first, regarding technology alliance, and this is my institution, API, is a joint initiative together with Shinas and NAWIX. And the basic idea is that technology is very important, not only economy, but also that diplomacy or military or politics or value kind of things. So what we thought about was like-minded democratic countries need to cooperate in this very important area. And I understand there are a lot of similar ideas, but what we emphasize is, number one, not only protecting, but also promotion is important. This is what Bill mentioned as a running faster part. This is also important. And also second, standard is also very important. Especially China is very eager to set up their own norm or standard. And for example, in the standard setting meeting, there are so many Chinese companies and Chinese people, but Western companies' representation is not sufficient enough. So we recommend, for example, that supporting that even travel fee or facilitating such kind of activity is also important. But anyway, our second point is that the standard. Third one is that we emphasize that flexible mechanism is better. So we do think we should set up new international organization based on treaty. That's not flexible, that's not efficient, and also it takes 10 years, 15 years for setting up. So flexible mechanism, informal gathering is very important. And also fourth thing is that our recommendation is we mentioned that there should be some chapeau organization. Of course, I mean, depending on the area, relevant country can be different. I mentioned that, for example, chips, semiconductor, in that case, for example, Netherlands, Korea, this is very important. But in other area, the relevant country can be different. For example, AI, or it depends on nature. So our idea is there is a chapeau or informal organization, but depending on agenda or theme or product, we are going to outreaching relevant countries. I think this is one way. The other way is that we are not going to setting up chapeau organization. So modular approach, depending on the sector, we consider smaller such kind of organization. Either way is okay. I still think there are some comparative advantage of setting up some chapeau organization. but it has its own hardware and cost. So I think either way is okay. But anyway, point is that the informal organization, this is better. That's what we propose. This is regarding technology alliance. And your first question regarding China's economic cohesion, I think this is very important, and Chinese activity toward Australia and increasing the tariff on barley or stopping import of beef or wine. So this is very serious agenda, I think. And I think like-minded countries should cooperate on this very important issue. I think there are 3 stages for cooperating on this. Number 1 is increasing WTO function. I think this is very important. Bill also mentioned that definition of national security. So point here is that we should not over usage of export control under the name of national security. This is important. And actually, in case of the China restrict rare earth export to Japan, 2010, we Japanese government brought this to WTO panel and we won, but it took 3 or 4 years. So my point here is that WTO improvement is very important. We are of course going to do that, but it takes a lot of time. And the individual dispute settlement itself takes a lot of time. So this is important, but this is not sufficient enough. Therefore, number 2, we need to cooperate for reducing over redundancy. I'm not saying that the total decoupling, it's in your words that partial decoupling or selective decoupling or that partial disengagement or managed interdependent. But anyway, reducing the over dependence, this should be seriously considered. I think that more than 70 years ago, that U.S. economist, he's originally from Germany, Mr. Hirschman, Dr. Hirschman mentioned that trade creates influence effect. This is trade increase GDP and make people more wealthier. This is a good thing. But trade also creates influence effect, influence. So the country which has a big economy and big trade, for them, the smaller countries' trade is relatively small. So there is asymmetry between smaller countries and big countries. Therefore, reducing such kind of influence effect is very important. This is number 2. And thirdly, I think there are some countermeasure mechanism is very important. Some people started to mention this as economic Article 5. So if China or any country have done bad things in economic cohesion, like-minded countries, counter this activity. And there are several ways for countering this. First one is that the name and shame. Like-minded country decide this is this is a very bad economic cohesion. So name and shame. And number 2, sharing burden. So this is the kind of insurance idea. For example, Australia suffered a lot of damage due to Chinese activity. In that case, that the member country is going to share some burden on this. This is number 2. Number 3, exactly that the counter attack, and we are going to sanction for such kind of activity. But anyway, this is the idea that we need solidarity and cooperation for stopping such kind of activity. So this is deterrence idea. I spoke too much.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. And Kato-san, so you work in Washington, D.C., where these discussions are really dominated by policy, policy community. So, but you really engage directly with the private sector stakeholders on a daily basis. So, and from the Atlantic Council, the Asia Security Program that I'm running, we often talk about and also hear a lot from our stakeholders about the gap in understanding between U.S. and allies and partners in the Pacific. So in a similar vein, I like to ask you, so what do you see as the probably biggest gap in terms of understanding between policy expert and private firms, like global firms or American firms? And with that in mind, would you like to share any specific policy recommendations for the U.S.-Japan cooperation?
Thank you. I believe, in the semiconductor industry, as I said, it's very, global, so that their, interest and their concern over the challenge posed by China are pretty much shared between, U.S. companies and American companies in semiconductor industry, so that there, since there is a shared concern, how we could, work it out to make sure, we can still be competitive and innovative in terms of the new technologies, and also secure the open and global free global market. So those are the common interests. So based on those common interests, what could be achievable is still needs to be seen. But again, those to make sure we have a globally open market. The work, as a couple of panelists pointed out, the reform in WTO, especially issues of government subsidy, is the area that maybe we can launch by including Europe, the trilateral initiative, and expand to like-minded countries, and make sure this is the rule-based international playground that everyone has to abide by or play with those rules. So that's I think things we would like to see through the U.S.-Japan cooperation.
Thank you so much. I'd like to take one of the Q&A question. So we have a question from Robert Donner. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia in the Treasury, and now he's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So his question: technology cooperation effort involving private companies, including standard setting, have always run up against the reluctance of companies to share plans or confidential information with competitors. Are there ways that government efforts can overcome this reluctance among private companies? I think we can do the same order of speaking, maybe, if that's okay. Starting with Bill.
Yeah, an excellent question, Bob. The one I've run into in other contexts several times in my career. It came up when we were trying to persuade companies to provide more information to the government that would assist them in enforcement. And it followed a pattern that I think would take place here too. Is you approach the executive, you say, well, let me talk to my general counsel. And the general counsel would say, this is on the enforcement side. The general counsel would say, well, if we can get a non-prosecution commitment out of the Justice Department, we'll be happy to share our information with you. And that was sort of the end of that, because the Justice Department would never agree to that. It's not necessarily a big problem. I think my answer would be two areas. One, depends on what you want them to share. And if you want them to share, non-proprietary information, but maybe not public information about what they're doing, I think, and you can appeal to their patriotism and their desire to help the government. The other thing you can do is set up an arrangement that is sort of like spokes in the wheel, in which each company is a spoke and the government is at the center. Companies share their information with the government. Government's not going to compete with them, but they don't share their information with their competitors. But the government ends up getting information from multiple sources, multiple companies that compete against each other, and then it figures out how to use that information in a way that doesn't discriminate. But the companies are not sharing with each other, which I think is the big problem.
Thank you. Stephen?
So that's obviously a very challenging question. I'll say one area in which I think the United States has done well in that regard is by setting up our national network of manufacturing institutes. We now have 16 manufacturing USA institutes. These are areas focused on advanced manufacturing, product and process technologies, in which a wide variety of American companies of all sizes, as well as international companies, have come together under a shared framework to both, kind of critically develop technology roadmaps, but also to develop and disseminate new intellectual property across the industry. And what these institutes have been able to do is come to IP covenants, make it clear, what IP is being contributed by certain companies. They retain rights to that, but then they benefit because they're getting benefits to new IP that's created. I think this is a framework that we should expand. And in fact, the CHIPS Act, which we haven't talked about yet, but this is legislation that was advanced last year and essentially was authorized in the NDA and now will hopefully be funded by the end of April by the Biden administration, potentially to the tune of as much as $37 billion. But it does, in fact, include provisions for several new semiconductor-focused manufacturing institutes, including potentially a new advanced packaging national manufacturing institute, as well as Institute for Semiconductor Manufacturing. So I think that would be a way, both in which we can work on some of these IP challenges, but also hopefully enroll Japan and US companies side by side in developing new advanced manufacturing technologies for semiconductors.
Thank you. Shinoya?
Yes, thank you. This is a very important question, I think. And I think even among like-minded countries, companies, they continue to compete each other. So I don't think there is a situation that all Western companies share all the information. This is a illusion, of course, and nobody expects such kind of things. Having said that, right now, situation is very asymmetrical. I mean, for example, in 3GPP, there are, of course, multiple Chinese companies, and they are, they were in that 3GPP, that standard decision-making body. So sometimes, for example, one company is trying to support the Qualcomm standard, but Chinese government somehow coordinated this and pushing this company to support the Chinese standard. I myself verified this information, but this is quoted and written in some other newspaper. And finally, the Chinese standard becomes a kind of standard. So this asymmetric situation should be somehow solved, I think. Again, Western countries will not disclose all very technical information. However, if that the standard is very important from the viewpoint of value, some coordination, top-level coordination, can be one way to equalize this asymmetric situation.
Thank you. Yoshikato?
Thank you. I believe that the term technology cooperation means many things. So we think I think staying away from those area of competitive, highly sensitive information, we still could work on rule setting or standard setting for the trusted vendors or trusted supply chains. So again, of course, as Mr. Oya pointed out, each companies compete with each other for the profit. But setting aside those area of competition, we still can have a area that we can work together in cooperation in terms of secure technologies.
Thank you. So we're about to wrap up, and thank you very much for everyone for tuning in. And I also like to thank our distinguished panelists for sharing their deep analysis and insights. And I can't really agree more on that. We need to have common definition of national security, and also really about clear and common definition in terms of the trusted partners when we really talk about the idea of a multilateral framework of technology alliance. I hope today's discussion helped find a way for the United States and Japan to cooperate in a concrete policy level and also working with other trusted partners. As I mentioned briefly at the beginning, we're launching a report on US-Japan cooperation on supply chains. So please stay tuned and we will see you again in our future event. Thank you.
Thank you.